Kaleb McGary's contract extension is going to stabilize the Falcons' offensive line and secure the right side that's going to drive the Falcons all the way to the playoffs.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Well, welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And if you do not know me, I am your humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. the iron that sharpens the iron, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at falcons.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast, almost coming up on 9 years this Thanksgiving as a humble host of the Locked On Falcons podcast. And I thank each and every one of you that goes strong with me as everydayers. That means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer, subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts to get the latest episode as soon as it is available. So today's episode, we will be talking about a subject that we wanted to talk about yesterday, but we just had so many Micah Parsons takes that we couldn't get to it. But we'll talk about why Zach Robinson is the world's biggest Penix pumper, right? And we'll talk about the potential ups and downs of Michael Penix in training camp practices, and will that carry over into the regular season, and why that's not maybe as big a concern as some people may try to make it out to be. We'll talk about what are Raheem's plans for the preseason action. He said, hey, guys are going to play this preseason. And so we'll talk about, is Raheem being honest or are we going to be disappointed come Friday night, at least for those of us that are pro preseason. But we'll start off with the story of the day. On Monday, the Falcons signed Kaleb McGary, their stalwart right tackle, to a 2-year, $30 million extension. We'll have to wait and see what the sort of details are when it comes to the guarantees of that deal. And that number, $15 million a year, is a little higher than what I kind of thought the Falcons would sign Kaleb McGary when looking at the market for 30-plus-year-old right tackles that are signing their third contracts. Guys like Jack Conklin, Rob Havenstein, Morgan Moses. Those guys are signing more in that $8 to $12 million a year range. So $15 million is a bit of a bump for what that market seemed to be suggesting for that guy, but ultimately we'll see what the guarantees are, and it could be a situation where the guarantees are much more in line with that 8 to 12 million that we're talking about, as opposed to the 15 million, and they're just padding out numbers or whatever. So it's likely that those guarantees are for this year and probably next year in 2026. So that should secure, even though this contract should, in theory, extend Kaleb McGary and keep him signed through the 2027 season. But it should definitely keep him in Atlanta Falcon for this upcoming season and the year following. And it makes sense that the Falcons would want to, go, I don't want to say the devil that but, roll with Kaleb McGary, given the unknown future with Kaleb McGary, who before today was heading into this 2025 season in a contract year, was poised to be a free agent. And we all look at Kaleb McGary, and we know some of the limitations that he has. We know that there's room for the Falcons to upgrade that position, but it was, it's basically a question of, we know they can do better, but it's really questionable, will they do better? Because as you've heard myself and Jarvis Davis talk about in the past, when it's come to drafting and developing, potential heir apparents to not only Kaleb McGary and Jake Matthews, the chances of you hitting on basically anybody outside of the first round at the offensive tackle position, and both Jake and Kaleb are certainly as testament to that. And again, we're not going to get into it today, but that's one of the things that people forget about Kaleb McGary, which is like the Falcons traded up for him, and that's led to a lot of people being, I think, overly critical of him, even though in hindsight, like, the Falcons are more than justified for trading up for him, because when you look at all the tackles that went immediately after him, between where the Falcons wound up trading up to like 29 to where they were originally picking up like a 43 or whatever it was, like all of those guys, basically, with the exception of, Titus Howard was a first round pick, but there was one guy, Jawan Taylor, are bad, and and Jawan Taylor hasn't been that good, but anyway, that's a separate conversation. But it's basically the idea, because the Falcons traded away their first round pick next year, all that to say, their chances of being able to find a better player than Kaleb McGary that's going to be able to step right in as early as 2026 and outplay Kaleb McGary and be that upgrade for Kaleb McGary was very low. What Jarvis and I have talked about, we talked about all throughout the offseason and last season. Look at the Kansas City Chiefs left tackle that they drafted, Kingsley Suamataia, in the second round of last year, and he stunk. And you can argue his inability to secure that left tackle position is directly responsible for the Chiefs losing the Super Bowl, right, this past year. So, with Kaleb McGary, it made sense to secure him because it's like, yeah, we're probably not going to get an upgrade this offseason based off of what the Falcons situation is like to be. And so we'll roll with Kaleb McGary knowing what he is. Now, obviously, there's a little risk to this, right? He's an older player with some injury history, and those problems typically tend to exacerbate once a player gets past 30 because the body doesn't recover as well as it did when it was 26, 27. And we've seen that reflected in previous right tackles for the Falcons, whether we're talking about guys like Ryan Schrader and Tyson Clabo and Todd Weiner. All those guys kind of lost it between the ages of like 30 and 32, right? And so Kaleb McGary is entering that time where, not to say he can't do it, but he's not a Jake Matthews type of player that you kind of expect, oh yeah, he could play at a high level until he's like 34, 35. That's not really what I think Kaleb McGary is, but so we'll see on that. I think a lot of the criticism is going to be surrounded, oh, well, he's protecting the blind side. And we've discussed this a little bit on the podcast, but like it feels like that whole he's protecting Michael Penix's blind side narrative is overblown because it doesn't really change anything for the offensive tackle. And Kaleb McGary and Jake Matthews have kind of explained this, and Dwayne Ledford has explained this throughout the offseason, where it's just like their job is the same regardless of where the quarterback is left-handed or right-handed. It doesn't really change much, and we won't get into all of that. But there are still going to be a handful of games. This is just who Kaleb McGary is. He's proven this pretty consistently throughout his NFL career. There's always going to be a handful of games where it's going to be a rough game for Kaleb McGary. And those games are going to get a lot of attention, and that leads to him being a very polarizing player among Falcon fans. And, the Kaleb McGary haters are really going through it today. Shout out to you guys. Big ups to you, in the words of Shawty Low, RIP. But those folks tend to focus on the bad, and that's just part of that's the nature of the offensive line play because, we won't get into it, but like basically people watch the game once, and when they watch the game, they're watching the ball. And so they only really notice offensive linemen when something terrible has happened, like they give up a sack, and they tend to focus on those two bad plays versus the 60 other plays where the guy did his job. But we know with Kaleb McGary, and I know a lot of people that listen to this podcast because we've been on Kaleb McGary Island since the 2021 season, defending Kaleb McGary on this illustrious podcast, that, we know of his limitations in pass protection. Those aren't going away, but he's gotten a lot better over the course of his NFL career when you compare it to where he was as a rookie. And what you're buying on Kaleb McGary is the run blocking. And we know that the strength of this Falcons offensive line is the right side with him and Chris Lindstrom. And when those two guys are in their groove, like it's one of the better run blocking duos in the entire NFL. And that's what the Falcons are leaning on. That's what the Falcons are paying for with this extension. And that's going to be something that is going to be important for this football team. We'll talk later about Michael Penix and some of the issues he may, some of the ups and downs he may experience early in the season. And, that's all the reason for the Falcons to lean on their running game to kind of stabilize things if that happens early in the season with the passing game. And so now you have your starting five as they sit here right now, pretty secure through the 2026 season, right? Chris Lindstrom is signed through the 2028 season. Jake Matthews is signed through 2028, although his guaranteed money carries him through the 2026 season. Bergeron and Nuzor are both signed through the 2026 season, and McGary's now signed through the 2027 season. But again, we're assuming that, those guarantees are going to carry through the 2026 season as well. So the Falcons are clearly comfortable with their starting five for this year and next year. We'll see, what they do in the offseason, whether, they continue to start planning for life after Kaleb McGary and life after Jake Matthews, particularly at the tackle position, or do they just say, hey, well 2027 is probably around the time where Jack Nelson is going to be figuring it out the position, and do they have a now less urgency to plant the seeds for those years now, as opposed to waiting until that point. And we're not going to get into it on today's episode, but we saw Dan Quinn's regime somewhat fall because they weren't proactive about their offensive line, because they had a lot of confidence in their veteran players from 2015 to 2017. And then once Andy Levitre and Chris Chester and Alex Mack and Ryan Trader all started to kind of age out in 2018 and beyond, you saw this offensive line really struggle for the next from 2018 and 2021 up until that 2022 season when Dwayne Ledford turned it all around. And so hopefully, this new regime doesn't fall into that trap. And so it's still planning for 2027 and beyond, and starting to plant those seeds now that will, bloom and be cultivated into, fully flowers and all that stuff in 2027 and beyond. So, but in the meantime, the Falcons should be pretty solid with their starting five. So those are the thoughts on Kaleb McGary's contract extension. To all of the Kaleb McGary haters, it's tough. We're sipping Mai Tais on this island, so come join us. But we'll be seeing. The thing that bothers me is not Kaleb McGary getting an extension. The thing that bothers me is, are we going to get guys some preseason action? And Raheem Morris said, yes, we will, except for a couple of guys. And so I want to unpack that and sort of talk a little bit more about, is Raheem being forthcoming, and will we see a significant change in Raheem Morris's approach to the preseason come Friday against the Detroit Lions? And we'll get into all of that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So this episode is presented by Yahoo Fantasy, and with the NFL kickoff almost here, means fantasy football is back in full swing. And this year, Yahoo Fantasy is turning things up with a fantasy football experience like never before. This year, I'm playing Yahoo Fantasy, and I think you should too, whether you're a first-timer or a veteran that's been in a million leagues. I've used Yahoo Fantasy for years, and the updates that they're rolling out this month are pretty wild. And I mean that in the good way. To celebrate 28 years of fantasy football greatness, Yahoo Fantasy is dropping 28 big new features over 28 days throughout August. And to kick it off, they just dropped the Yahoo Fantasy Guillotine Leagues, a killer new way to play fantasy football on Yahoo, where the lowest scoring team gets eliminated each week until there's one team left standing. With the season around the corner, now's the time to get your league together and give this new mode a try. And if you're more into the classics, you can still play in head-to-head private leagues or join a public league. Stay tuned for more killer announcements and start playing Yahoo Fantasy Football now at yahoofantasy.com/LockedOnNFL. So Raheem Morris talked to the media on Monday and was asked about, what are their plans for the preseason game this Friday against Detroit. And he said a lot more players will see the field based around how many young players they have. And I'm like, okay, that sounds great. And then I looked it up and compared to at least how the Falcons played in the first preseason game. And, I think Raheem was making this statement relative to how they played guys in the final preseason game last summer. But in the first preseason game last summer against the Miami Dolphins, the Falcons played about 65 players in their opener. And I just looked at their depth chart today, and they got 91 players on the roster, and I count 24 that I'm very confident will not play against the Lions right now. And so that would mean basically there will be about 67 guys that will play against the Lions at most. And that doesn't include guys like Jalen Walker or Keith Taylor. And so that number may be actually less than 60, down to 65 or less. Now, in the third preseason game against the Jaguars last summer, they played about 51 guys. And so, again, I think that's really what Raheem is referring to, like the most recent preseason game where only about half the roster played. So, yeah, I think more guys will play than that. And so he's already ruled out Michael Penix and Kirk Cousins. The way that Michael Penix talked after practice today sounded like he doesn't expect to play at all in the preseason, which is not really a surprise. As we said at the beginning of training camp, this is going to be an ongoing story, ongoing storyline. I know, to the chagrin of some folks, like, what are you talking about? What else are we going to talk about, guys? It's August. But, I talked earlier about sort of having done some research that suggests that, playing guys in the preseason does have a positive impact on early season outcomes for the Atlanta Falcons. I can't speak for all other NFL teams. We're not going to get into that on today's episode, but that will be potentially something that we will unpack on, tomorrow or later this week before we get to that Lions game. But, I'm hoping that we get to see some action for some of these guys. That Raheem Morris's words indicate that they're not just going to do what they did last year, particularly with some of the veteran players on the defensive side of the ball that we kind of knew were going to make the team. And those guys basically I think 2 series of action, like 6 to 8 snaps. We're talking about guys like Lorenzo Carter and Richie Grant and Eddie Goldman, Kentavious Street, Taquan Graham in last year's Dolphins preseason opener, where they basically just played a handful of snaps and then they pulled the plug, and then we never saw them in the preseason again. And the types of, if Raheem is going to do that, the types of guys that I would imagine he would do that with on this year's roster, those would be guys like Arnold Ebiketie, guys like Zach Harrison, who, have been around the block and probably don't necessarily need the reps to the degree that some of the other younger players that have not had, 2-3 years under their belts in the NFL. And then, of course, the question is going to be, how often are they going to play the rookies? Now, you look at last year's rookie class in that first Dolphins game, most of them played around 24 snaps, right? Michael Penix played 24 snaps. Brandon Dorlus, Rook Aurora, Braylon Trice all played between 23 and 29 snaps. Trice obviously probably would have played a few more snaps had he not suffered that ACL tear in the game. Jason McClellan played 26 snaps. Zion Logue played 22 snaps. JD Bertrand and Casey Washington both played 40 snaps. So, we'll see what this year's crop of rookies do. But I look at Jalen Walker, he did return to practice today. He indicated after practice that he's fully ready to go. I imagine the Falcons are still going to be cautious with him. And he was a limited participant in Monday's practice. And so I would not expect him to play this Friday for that reason. I'll be curious to see, with Xavier Watts also being kind of limited the last couple of days in practice, if they will also hold him out for this upcoming preseason game. Raheem indicated that they'll have a better idea about who's going to play later in the week, which I think is kind of referring to some of these guys that are a little nicked up, like Walker and Watts, as opposed to, I think again, there's 24 guys on the roster that we kind of know are not going to play, many of them being starters, particularly on the offense, and then several established veterans on the defense. But, I'm curious with James Pierce and Billy Bowman, who I think we will, I hope boy, it'll not be fun. We got to watch the whole preseason game and not get, just give me a taste. I just want to see what James Pierce can do to Kobe Sorsdahl or whoever the backup Lions offensive lineman is. Just give me a taste of it, But, I'll be curious to see how they divvy up the snaps. If I was guessing between Pierce, Bowman, and Nelson, I would guess Nelson probably going to play somewhere around 40 snaps based off of last year's precedent at the offensive tackle position. I hope we get to see Pierce and Bowman maybe for 25-ish snaps, like some of the other rookies we saw last summer. But I could also see the Falcons being we like what they're going to do. We believe, the joint practices are going to be more valuable to those guys. And so we don't want to, expose them too much to injury. And so therefore maybe they're in that bucket of guys that the veterans usually are, that only play, 8 snaps or something like that. So that's my worry. Again, I know for a lot of folks, it's, why are you worried? You don't want these guys to get hurt. And it's sure, obviously you got to mitigate that risk. You got to find that balance. But I feel like the Falcons go a little bit too far on but I get it, because, their depth is not very good. And so any injuries that happen this preseason will be very problematic for this football team. So we'll see how they balance that. I've made peace with Raheem's decisions. I don't agree with him, and we'll explain on future episodes why, but it is what it is. So we will see what's what on that. I'm sure this is not going to be the last time we talk about should they play guys in the preseason, and we'll have thoughts, throughout the week and after Friday, and then subsequent preseason games to be and then ultimately week 1 we'll get here and we'll be like, they should have played guys more in the preseason. or hey, it was a non-issue. So we'll find out. September 7th will be sort of the definitive take on it. I know from last year, a lot of people look at the struggles against the Steelers and say, "Oh, we should have played guys more in the preseason." I'm in favor of playing guys in the preseason, but I don't really adhere to that belief. That to me, the struggles against the Steelers was because of the terrible, no good, Bruno game plan that we don't talk about that Zach Robinson had. Like, wasn't, playing more reps in the preseason was not going to stop the Falcons, unless you were convinced that that was going to stop the Falcons for putting Kaleb McGary on an island against TJ Watt or to incorporate play action into their game plan. Like, I don't think playing in the preseason was as meaningful as some people like to liken the two. But not to mention, as we talked about a lot last summer, Kirk Cousins has a tendency to start season slow in the month of September. So like that wasn't new, but it is what it is. But we'll see on that front. Well, I'm sure we'll continue talking about it. But does Michael Penix need the reps? That's certainly a debatable conversation, and I'm sure we will be healthy and civil in the comments below. But he's been up and down in the preseason or in the training camp practices. He had an up day on Monday, following arguably 2 down days on Thursday and Friday of last week. And I want to talk about how that potentially could mirror what we might see from Michael Penix early in the season, but why there's no reason to panic about that, because ultimately, the clutch gene that Michael Penix has will kick in, and we'll break that down as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Have you ever wished that managing your money felt easier? Well, it can with Monarch Money. Whether you're growing your savings or planning a big purchase, Monarch Money is going to put you in the driver's seat. It's like having your own personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money is more than a budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, and spending all in one place. So in addition to managing your money, you're also building wealth. Locked On has been very good to me these past few years, and I'd still want to continue having Locked On be good to me. But one of the ways I could do that is, managing my spending, sticking to my budgets, all that. And Monarch Money is a tool that will help me do those and reach my financial goals, and they can help you reach yours. All you got to do to take control of your finances is go to Monarch Money and use code LOCKEDONNFL at monarchmoney.com. You'll get 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com. Code LOCKEDONNFL for half off your first year. So, as I wanted to discuss on yesterday's episode, following on the heels of Friday's practice, which was a down practice by all accounts for Michael Penix, and Zach Robinson spoke to the media after practice. I think that was the first time he's spoken since the start of training camp. And I believe it was our good buddy Josh Kendall, who we had on the podcast on Thursday, talking about Michael Penix's misses on that particular practice, the interception he had in that practice. And I believe Josh asked Zach this question around sort of his thoughts on Penix's accuracy and some of the misses. And basically, Zach Robinson was like, he doesn't miss. Right? And just because you think you saw him miss doesn't mean he actually missed. Like, he saw something that you didn't quite see or whatever. And shout out to my friend and arch nemesis, Trayshawn Diaz, who over the weekend in the Locked On Falcons Discord, hit the link in the description if you want to join the conversation, sort of basically said this made Zach Robinson the preeminent Penix pumper out there, because basically, saying like, hey, that's not a miss. That ball that went 4 feet above that receiver's head or that was in the dirt, that wasn't a miss. He was trying something and you just didn't see it. Right? He was trying to. There was a black widow crawling on the player's cleats, and he wanted to kill it before he bit him. So, like, not a miss. And I'm obviously joking, guys, but it felt some type of way that the way Zach Robinson responded to it, that I had to go back. For those of you that don't know, I've been evaluating draft prospects since 2001, and along the ways, I evaluated a young Oklahoma State quarterback named Zach Robinson back in 2009. And I was like, and I've kept up with my notes mostly because, like, when I do my NFL player comparisons, I want to know, like, oh, what did I think about that guy that came out in 2014 that I'm about to make this comp to? But I had my notes of Zach Robinson, talked about, some inconsistent anticipation, some erratic accuracy, that he played across the games I watched at Oklahoma State. And so it made me think like maybe he's still dealing with some of the trauma of his own draft cycle where people were like, oh, you're not an accurate quarterback. And it's like, how dare you? I am an accurate quarterback. Michael Penix is accurate. You just don't know. You're not seeing what he's seeing. But, the point of all that is, Penix has been up and down at times in practice. We've had 7 practices now, including Monday, 4 good, including Mondays, 3 less good, let's say. And I've seen 2 main reactions to these sort of ups and downs. There's been one reaction, which, I think there's 2 wrong reactions, and then there's the right reaction, which, coincidentally is my reaction, that third reaction. I just, happen to be right or whatever. But, I think one of the wrong reactions is an overreaction and sort of looking at Penix's down performances as a major red flag of impending doom for the upcoming season. And like, all right, relax. And then I think there's the underreaction, which is like, it's not an issue. And it's like, why do you care about this? And like, again, it's kind of more in line with what Zach Robinson said. Like it wasn't bad, actually. Like, you just don't know what you're talking, right? It's just kind of ignoring and dismissing it. And then the correct, that's also wrong. And then the correct one is, right in the middle, right? We live in the middle. And it's kind of just taking it for what it is. And it's probably going to mirror what we're going to see in the regular season, right? We saw this kind of in his first 3 starts last year, where he had 2 really good games against the Giants and Carolina, and then 1 questionable game against Washington. And, we like to focus on his clutch performance against the Commanders. And, that is very meaningful in those last like 5 or so minutes of that game. But if you pay attention to his play the first 3-ish quarters of that game, it was not very good. And you can argue that if he had just been average for the first 3 quarters, that the Falcons would have won the game. And now, let me make it clear, I'm not suggesting that Michael Penix is to blame for why the Falcons lost that game. Again, if we're going to the hierarchy of blame, he would be lower on the totem pole. Raheem's clock management would be number 1. The Falcons' inability to even get a finger on Jaden Daniels, for 3 quarters would probably be number 2. Shout out to D. Alford. Not being able to cover Olamide Zaccheaus or Zach Ertz in that game would probably be number 3. And then maybe you would slot Penix's inconsistency and spraying some footballs for 3 quarters as maybe number 4. And so that's kind of what I kind of expect potentially we'll see again this upcoming season, where it's the accuracy is not going to be a major concern for a couple of games. And then there's just going to be one random game, like every 3 or 4 games or whatever it's going to be, where he's going to spray some footballs and we're like, like he didn't have it that day or whatever. And, again, you hope, like we saw in that Washington game, when it matters late in the game, he makes the throws that he needs to make, right? And so you can kind of map that on to, looking ahead to the regular season, particularly the first 6 weeks, where we will continue discussing, the importance of the Falcons, coming out and hopefully, going at least 500 in those first 6 games to get them, put themselves in prime playoff position. But, you kind of can look at those 6 games and say, like, probably 2 of them he'll be great. 2 of them he might be a little questionable and downright bad maybe. And then 2 of them we don't really know, right? And if I was to guess, again, we'll see how I feel. These opinions will probably change as we get closer to September. So nothing is set in stone. But if I was to guess, like the 2 games he'll probably shine in against Tampa Bay and Carolina, the 4 games that you could argue the Falcons offense looked the best in last year with the 4 games they played against Tampa Bay and Carolina last year, though in Dallas maybe as the 5th game in the mix. And I have every reason to believe that trend, Kirk was able to perform in several of those games, Penix as well in one of the Carolina games. And so there's no reason for me to think that trend will stop in 2025 with Penix at the helm. Then when you look at those first 6 games, that road game against Minnesota, that Buffalo Bills game on Monday Night Football or Sunday Night Football, whichever primetime it is after the bye week, are probably the games that you don't expect Penix to go out there and ball out going up against those defenses that have consistently been some of the top defenses in the NFL for several years running. And then you have the Washington game and the road game against the 49ers, right? Washington in week 4, San Francisco in week 7. And those are kind of the toss-up games because it's like it could go either way, right? Like you feel a little bit better about his ability to handle Washington. That he saw them last year and he can build off of that. And then San Francisco is like, okay, are we going to get a classic Robert Saleh defense in San Francisco? If so, that's going to be a challenge for Michael Penix in this Falcons offense. So we'll see how it all plays out. But to me, the thing that gets me excited about Michael Penix is not, he's going to be able to avoid all these pitfalls, particularly early in the season. It's, going back to that Washington game, how he finished that game. It's the ability to not just a strong start, but it's a strong finish, right? It's the body of work that he has shown that indicates that he does respond well to adversity. That was something that I believe Zach Robinson pointed out in his Friday thing where, he said he didn't miss, but like at the same time, he was like, even when he has a bad rep, hypothetically, if he has a bad but hypothetically, if Michael Penix has a bad rep, he responds and does good work after that and bounces back. And you can't teach that stuff. And we talked about it at the end of last year and throughout the offseason, where we talked about his struggles deciphering and diagnosing Tampa 2 against Washington, and then coming out the next week against Carolina and carving it up, right? And so even though he's been up and down for the most part this summer, he hasn't followed a bad practice. He's followed every bad practice with a good one. So these are the things that I focus on, and we will see if they manifest this summer, if that maps onto the summer where we have these ups and downs early through the first half of training camp. And then in the back half of training camp, once we get further into August, you start to see him consistently stacking good days, and these down days, or whatever you want to call them, are things of the past. So I think that's where I kind of look at it, in terms of what I kind of expect. We will continue to talk about, what are realistic expectations for Michael Penix. But, I think these are sort of how I sort of see it. And so as people go back and forth debating and arguing and yelling at each other about, is Michael Penix have issues? Is he perfect? Is all these things that are inevitable when it comes to the quarterback. People love to argue about the quarterback. The most heat I get in my YouTube comments since joining YouTube back in October of 2021 stems from opinions about the quarterback. And it's just like, people just really struggle with the idea that another human being could possibly have a slightly different opinion about a quarterback than you do. And as I've said many times over the years, like, it's my least favorite part of fandom, which is the constant bickering and arguing. But again, it is what it is. It's inevitable. So I'll continue to give my honest assessment of Michael Penix here on the podcast. And for those 90% of you that are everydayers that appreciate that, continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. For the 10% of you that don't, you can still listen. By all means, I'm not going to complain about getting the views. But you're not going to be happy, I guess, if someone having a slightly different opinion about a quarterback bothers you so much. Then it is what it's going to be. So we will see what happens with Michael Penix. We will see what happens with the Falcons this preseason. Again, continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen if you want to get those updates on that. Checking us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And of course, check out Locked On Bets, getting you geared up not only with football futures, but MLB locks every single day. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.